Declassified, 1943. High above the volcanic islands of the South Pacific, a silver shadow cuts through the morning haze. Below him, American corsairs climb aggressively, hunting for Japanese fighters protecting a critical supply convoy. They have no idea they are being watched by a demon. This demon wasn't born into the samurai class. He was the son of a humble fisherman from Shikoku, and by the war's end, he would achieve 87 confirmed victories, making him the most lethal naval aviator in Imperial Japanese history. How did the most unlikely pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy become its most feared warrior? This is the story of the man they called the Phantom of Rabaul, the record that defied all odds, and the devastating price of mastery in the brutal skies of the Pacific War. While Hiroshi Takamura was learning to read the ocean currents, the world was fragmenting into chaos. In Europe, war consumed entire nations. In Asia, the Empire of Japan was executing its grand design for regional dominance. By 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy was the most powerful maritime force in the Pacific, and it needed pilots. Takamura, like so many young men of his generation, answered the call. He volunteered for the Navy's rigorous aviation training program, driven not by nationalist fervor, but by a profound connection to the sky that reminded him of the open sea. His instructors at Tsushira Air Group noticed it immediately. The fisherman's son possessed an uncanny spatial awareness, an ability to read three-dimensional movement that seemed almost supernatural. He didn't just fly an aircraft, he inhabited it. But this raw talent came wrapped in a dangerous package, an independence of thought that bordered on insubordination. Stationed at Opama Air Base near Yokosuka, Flight Petty Officer Takamura was introduced to the legendary Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the fighter that would define Japanese naval aviation. He fell in love instantly, and that passion nearly ended his career before it truly began. During a training exercise over Sagami Bay, Takamura executed a series of unauthorized maneuvers that left his flight instructor simultaneously furious and astounded. He flew inverted, mere meters above the water, testing the Zero's envelope in ways the manual explicitly forbade. He performed a snap roll during a simulated attack run that could have torn the wings off a lesser aircraft. He was pushing boundaries, exploring limits that other pilots feared to approach. His squadron commander, Captain Minoru Genda, was a brilliant tactician who had helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. When Takamura stood before him, expecting to be expelled from the program, he faced a quiet, penetrating examination. Genda saw past the breach of protocol. He recognized what the instructors had seen: an intuitive genius, a pilot who understood flight at a cellular level. Genda, one of the most forward-thinking officers in the Imperial Navy, made a calculated decision. Instead of crushing this unconventional talent, he would refine it into a blade. He personally oversaw Takamura's advanced training, pushed him through the most demanding combat simulations, and then deployed him to the front lines. By August 1942, Takamura was stationed at Rabaul, the fortress base that anchored Japanese air power in the South Pacific. This was a cauldron of constant aerial combat, where Japanese and Allied forces clashed daily in increasingly desperate battles for air superiority. The American pilots he would face were not inexperienced. They flew the new F-4U Corsairs and P-38 Lightnings, powerful machines backed by industrial might. The Corsair in particular was a brute, a fighter with a massive engine that could outrun and outdive almost anything Japan possessed. On paper, the technological balance was shifting against the empire. But Takamura wasn't flying an ordinary Zero. His aircraft, designated A6M Model 22, was a refined evolution of the legendary fighter. It retained the extraordinary agility that made the Zero famous, while incorporating slightly better armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, improvements learned through bitter experience. More importantly, Takamura understood the Zero's true nature in a way few pilots did. The Americans saw it as a fragile target. He saw it as a precision instrument, a fighter that rewarded finesse over brute force. His combat philosophy emerged from an unexpected source: his childhood on the fishing boats. His father had taught him that the sea demanded patience, timing, and an understanding of natural rhythms. You didn't fight the ocean, you moved with it, anticipated its patterns, and struck at the precise moment of vulnerability. Takamura applied this wisdom to aerial combat with devastating results. While other pilots relied on aggressive, frontal attacks, he developed a doctrine built on deception and perfect timing. His method was elegant in its brutality. First position: use the Zero's superior maneuverability to achieve an unexpected angle of attack, preferably from the sun or cloud cover. Second, patience. Never commit to an attack until the geometry was perfect, the deflection calculated, the escape route secured. Fourth, economy. Fire in short, precise bursts using the 20mm cannon. The Zero carried limited ammunition, every shot had to count. Fifth, disappear. After the strike, use the Zero's incredible turning radius to vanish into the vertical or horizontal plane, leaving the enemy searching empty sky. His combat reports filed with the 204th Air Group were models of restraint. He documented altitude, weather conditions, and outcomes with clinical precision. What they didn't capture was the artistry involved, the way he could predict an enemy pilot's next move based on subtle changes in their flight attitude, the way he could place his aircraft in a position where the enemy would literally fly into his line of fire. His squadron mates called him Kage, the Shadow, because he seemed to materialize from nowhere, strike with lethal precision, and vanish before the Americans could react.
Lieutenant Commander Saburo Nakajima, a highly decorated ace, observed Takamura's technique and described it as the way of water, flowing around obstacles, finding the path of least resistance, and drowning the enemy before they realize they're underwater. His ammunition efficiency was extraordinary. While average pilots expended hundreds of rounds per kill, Takamura's gun camera footage showed kills achieved with bursts of less than 2 seconds. His victory count began its relentless climb. 2 Wildcats over Bougainville, 3 Corsairs in a single mission defending a convoy, a B-24 bomber that fell like a wounded bird after a single devastating pass. He was a ghost in the Pacific sky, appearing from impossible angles, killing with surgical precision, and disappearing into the vast blue emptiness. The Americans, analyzing their mounting losses, began reporting encounters with what they called the Silver Phantom, a Zero pilot who fought with tactics they couldn't predict or counter. On his own Zero, he painted a simple wave design on the fuselage, a tribute to his father and the sea that had shaped him. It became a feared symbol in the South Pacific. Allied pilots who survived encounters with the wave-marked Zero spoke of an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move, who turned their own tactics against them with contemptuous ease. By early 1943, he was an ace many times over. By year's end, his confirmed victory total exceeded 40, a number that placed him among the elite of Japanese naval aviation. December 1943, above the Bismarck Sea. A massive formation of American B-25 bombers, escorted by 24 fighters, approached a critical Japanese supply convoy. The convoy represented the lifeline for isolated garrisons across the South Pacific. Its loss would be catastrophic. Takamura led a flight of 8 Zeros, outnumbered 3-1. To the Americans, it looked like a routine mission. To Takamura, it was a mathematical problem with a lethal solution. Instead of the expected head-on interception, he deployed his fighters in a dispersed formation that appeared passive, almost defensive. He allowed the American formation to commit to their bombing run, to focus their attention downward toward the ships. Then, with perfect timing, he attacked not from ahead or behind, but from the side, exploiting a blind spot in the American defensive formation. His Zeros struck like a coordinated flock of predatory birds, each pilot assigned a specific target. Takamura himself went for the formation leader, a B-25 painted with distinctive nose art. He approached from a 45-degree angle, compensating for deflection with instinctive precision. A 2-second burst from his cannon, and the bomber's right engine exploded. He didn't wait to watch it fall. He was already maneuvering toward a corsair that had broken formation to engage. The American pilot tried to use his aircraft's superior speed to escape, diving hard toward the ocean. Takamura didn't chase. He anticipated the pilot's next move, positioning his Zero precisely where the corsair would pull out of its dive. When the American pulled up, he flew directly into Takamura's line of fire. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. When it was over, 6 American aircraft were destroyed, the convoy was safe, and Takamura's flight returned to Rabaul with no losses. Japanese combat reports called it a perfect defense. American after-action reports described it as a massacre. They knew they had been outthought, outmaneuvered, and utterly dominated. By March 1944, Hiroshi Takamura had 64 confirmed victories. This wasn't just remarkable, it was historically unprecedented for a Japanese naval pilot. He had become a living legend, a symbol of Japanese martial excellence. Admiral Itosuke Yamamoto, before his death, had personally decorated Takamura with the Navy's highest honors. But fame came with complications. The Imperial Navy, recognizing his propaganda value, began restricting his combat missions. He was too valuable to lose, a symbol that Japan desperately needed as the tide of war began to shift. Takamura chafed under these restrictions. In letters to his younger sister Yuki, he wrote about feeling like a caged bird, watching his comrades fight and die, while he was paraded before cameras and journalists. He petitioned his commanders repeatedly, arguing that his place was in the sky, not behind a desk. Eventually, a compromise was reached. He would be assigned only to critical defensive missions, operations where his tactical genius could make a genuine difference. The war was changing. American industrial power was overwhelming Japanese production. New American pilots, better trained and flying improved aircraft, were flooding into the theater. The quality gap that had once favored Japan was narrowing, then reversing. But Takamura continued to fight with the same cold precision that had defined his early career. He adapted his tactics to account for the Americans' improving skill, developing new techniques for engaging the faster, more heavily armed aircraft they now flew. June 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Imperial Navy launched a massive carrier-based strike against American forces, hoping to achieve a decisive victory. It became known to the Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a slaughter of Japanese naval aviation. In the chaos of that battle, with Japanese aircraft falling from the sky by the dozens, Takamura led a small flight of Zeros in a desperate defense of the carrier Shikoku. Against overwhelming odds, facing swarms of Hellcats and Corsairs, he employed every technique he had perfected over 2 years of combat. He used clouds for concealment, the sun for blinding attacks, and his intimate knowledge of the Zero's capabilities to achieve impossible positions. In the span of 30 minutes, he shot down 7 American aircraft. But it wasn't enough. The Shikoku, his home base, was hit by multiple torpedoes and would eventually sink. He watched it go down, a floating city consumed by fire and sea, taking hundreds of his comrades with him. By November 1944, Takamura's confirmed total stood at 87 victories. The number was staggering, a testament to skill, luck, and an almost supernatural ability to survive in a war that was devouring Japanese pilots at a catastrophic rate. But the strategic situation was hopeless. American forces were closing on the Japanese home islands. Air raids were becoming routine. The materials needed to maintain aircraft were disappearing. Fuel was so scarce that training flights were canceled. His final combat mission was flown on February 15, 1945, defending Tokyo against a massive B-29 raid. His Zero, worn and patched from countless missions, struggled to reach the altitude where the silver bombers flew. He managed to damage one superfortress before his ammunition ran out. He landed at a base that was under constant bombardment, his aircraft so battered that it would never fly again. There were no replacement Zeros. The war, for Hiroshi Takamura, was effectively over. In March 1945, he was transferred to a training role, teaching the next generation of pilots the tactics that had kept him alive. But these new pilots, boys really, had perhaps 20 hours of flight time. They were being sent into combat in inferior aircraft against an enemy that controlled the skies. Many would be dead within days of their first mission. He taught them everything he could, knowing it wouldn't be enough. The end came in August. The atomic bombs fell. The Emperor's voice, never before heard by common citizens, crackled over radio speakers announcing surrender. For Takamura, the war ended not with a glorious final battle, but with silence. The roar of engines ceased. The sky, which had been his domain, his battlefield, his home, was empty. In the post-war years, Takamura returned to Shikoku, to the fishing village where he had been born. He never spoke publicly about his war experiences. The records of his 87 victories were buried in archives, forgotten in Japan's collective desire to move past the war. He lived quietly, eventually taking over his father's fishing business, spending his days on the same waters where he had learned to read the wind and waves. He died in 1989, at the age of 67, his story largely unknown outside of military history circles. There was no grand monument, no historical center bearing his name. Japan had chosen to remember the war differently, and individual warriors, no matter how skilled, were footnotes to a national tragedy. But among aviation historians, among those who study the technical aspects of aerial combat, Hiroshi Takamura's record remains a subject of fascination. 87 confirmed victories achieved in an aircraft that was increasingly outclassed against an enemy with virtually unlimited resources,